Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kilic Bugra Kanat, and I'm the research director at SETA Foundation. Welcome to our panel on the implications of the move of U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. We have an excellent panel today to discuss what would be the implications of this move to U.S. foreign policy, to the region, and the peace process. And a short introduction of the panelists. On my left, Geoffrey Aronson, president of the Mortons Group; Lara Friedman, president of Foundation for Middle East Peace; Ghaith al-Omari, senior fellow, the Washington Institute; and Kadir Ustun, the executive director of the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. Instead of having presentations today, and to make it much more interactive, we will start with questions, and then I will, after asking a few questions to the panelists, I will open the floor for more questions from the audience so that it will be much more interactive. I'm pretty sure that there will be questions for our panelists. And we will start with Geoffrey. And Jeff recently wrote us an analysis, or a brief report actually, on the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which will be published in the probably next week. And in his piece, he mentioned that the move of the embassy will create the similar impact with the Balfour Declaration. Yes. So what do you mean by that, and what could be the implications of this embassy move to the region as a whole?
Okay. First of all, thanks to SETA for having me, and thank you all for coming today. I thought a fair bit about the Balfour Declaration connection, and not only because it makes a great opening sentence in an article. What was the Balfour Declaration? Number one, it was evidence of Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It meant that the most important imperial power had lined up in a declarative fashion in support of a Zionist program. Okay. Now, if we compare that to the recent decision of the Trump administration, the decision to relocate the embassy there, again, is a declaration of support and identity with a major important plank in the current political program of the Israeli government. Secondly, the Balfour Declaration I lost my train of thought here. That's what happens when you get to be 63. Things fade away.
He looks younger.
Yeah. Secondly, it acknowledges the success of an Israeli operational strategy, which we call, in the context of settlements, facts on the ground. In the Balfour era, again, it was recognizing the reality and the staying power of what at that time was a relatively small Zionist project in Palestine. The third point, and one that's equally important, is the caveats that accompanied the Balfour Declaration. The most important historically one of which was nothing that we're saying today will prejudice the rights of the local people. And we all know how that worked out in 1917, and the similar protestations of the Trump administration, most recently in statements of Secretary of State Pompeo in Amman and elsewhere, that we really haven't done much of anything. We're not prejudicing the final status. We're not recognizing the fact that Israel has annexed the eastern part of the city. None of this is inherent or needs to follow directly from the decision to recognize reality, excuse me, and establish an embassy in West Jerusalem, although interestingly, the appellation West in front of the city name is rarely invoked in this context by U.S. officials, if ever. I haven't seen it. And again, just like the Balfour Declaration, these caveats suggesting that the import of the decision is somehow less historic than in fact it is, I think will be shown to be untrue.
Thank you. And Lara, what do you think will be the impact of this decision to U.S. foreign policy? Because there are debates that it is getting much more Israeli-oriented in Middle East, especially after the decision to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal and the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. What could you say about the future of U.S. foreign policy in the region?
Sure. So, and thank you again. And I want to very much thank Jeff for the broad arc of history that he brings to this in his analysis. For me, it's less what this does to U.S. policy in the region versus what it says about U.S. policy in the region. You know, I would suggest that it's time. I mean, this decision, when it happened at the end of last year, the announcement of the embassy move was really a signal, I think, that we really need to start taking this administration at its word when it says things it's going to do, from moving the embassy to getting out of the Iran nuclear deal. This administration actually, and I've said this before, people talk about the incoherence and chaos in this administration's policies, foreign and domestic. I would argue that its Middle East policies are not chaotic at all. I do think they're reckless. I think there's enormous coherence, starting with the naming of the current ambassador. The same set of people who have been advising, who are now advising this president on the Middle East, and particularly on Israel-Palestine, which is a focus for a lot of them, have been his advisors since long before he became a candidate, and certainly were his advisors and his surrogates during his candidacy. And they are very clear. They see U.S. and Israeli interests to be identical, and they identify Israeli interests when they identify them the same way that the hard right in Israel, and in a way that's similar to the evangelicals here in the United States, which is really a sense of not just standing with Israel, but sometimes standing in front of Israel and leading on the policy of Israel's own right. That's really where we find ourselves today. The import of the Jerusalem decision and now the actual moving of the embassy, I mean, there could not have been a clearer signal from this administration that the Oslo era is over. And many analysts will tell you the Oslo era has been over for a long time. It's been just, there's been this diplomatic cover. But fundamentally, the international community was still committed to it and broadly is still committed to two states. And the U.S. was at great pains to show itself rhetorically still committed to two states and to a diplomatic process and only to a negotiated solution. With this move, and this is President Trump's words, they have taken Jerusalem off the table. And you can have all of the diplomatic fine print that accompanies a decision like this. It's clear the diplomatic fine print on this decision was irrelevant, and what they've done is taken Jerusalem off the table. Like Jeff said, they never say West Jerusalem, they say Jerusalem. And then they'll say, yes, but we're not saying anything about final borders. But by the same token, this administration, even before they announced they're moving the embassy, stopped criticizing settlement activity in East Jerusalem, has been extremely critical of any statements by the Palestinians claiming any rights in any part of Jerusalem. And as we look ahead, once you have taken the Oslo framework or even a diplomatic negotiated framework off the table, it opens the door for the kind of things that this administration has been hinting at since it came into office. We'll get the Saudis on board, and they will deliver the Palestinians for us. We will build a broad international coalition and effectively impose an agreement on the parties, on the Palestinians, not on Israel. And this is seen as a solution. And, as I said, in a different context, one man's catastrophe is another man's miracle. For Israel, for the hardliners in Israel, this is welcome, as is a whole remaking of the Middle East for some of the Sunni states, for people who are worried about Iran, whatever. We're seeing a period here of chaos deliberately injected in order to promote what appears to be, and I'm not attributing intent, I'm taking seriously their stated intent. It appears to be an intent to really reframe the entire concept of Middle East peace and recreate it from a perspective that says, here's what Israel wants, how do we make it so? And impose that on the region and then somehow derive stability from that. As an analyst, I don't believe that that will create stability. I don't see any Palestinian leader accepting it. And on Jerusalem, in some ways, we've already started to see some of the limits of how far they can go. So if this administration thought that their new friends in Saudi Arabia would have their back as they basically gave all of Jerusalem to the Palestinians, what you saw very quickly was, okay, we have the Israelis, yes. You saw groupings of Arab states getting together to say, no, 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 you can't do this. You saw Turkey taking a role. You saw the senior leadership of Saudi Arabia sort of, reining in a little bit the junior leadership. Jerusalem may actually, as much as it is seen by some as the key to ending the whole idea of two states and negotiated solutions, may also be what forces some limits on what they can do. It remains to be seen.
What do you think? Mr. Kushner mentioned that they are working on a peace plan for the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, actually. What do you think it will entail at this point?
The crystal ball. There's a lot of people with crystal balls in Washington speculating on what that deal will entail. I am no better than anyone else in terms of crystal ball reading. My reading of this, like I said, my preference in my analysis is not to try to look into the hearts of people, but to look into what they've said and done so far. My analysis based on what they've said and done so far is that I think we will see a plan perhaps issued at some point when it suits them. I don't quite know what that timing will be. They've been promising it for months and months now, and it keeps getting put off. I heard now it's going to be after Ramadan. My assumption is that that plan will include elements that are utterly unacceptable to the Palestinians, based on the fact that we have already staked out positions that are utterly unacceptable to the Palestinians. I don't see a plan rolling that back or including any enticements that will suddenly say, we're okay, we give up on Jerusalem, this is a great plan. I don't see that happening. I think far more likely is we're going to have a plan that is not acceptable to the Palestinians, not acceptable to most of the region. I think perhaps Israel and some of the Arab states will say this is something we can work with. But the most important thing in this plan, I believe, will be that it will effectively, in the premises of the plan, lay out new U.S. positions on all the permanent status issues. We've already taken Jerusalem off the table, permanent status issue 1. We've effectively taken settlements and land off the table. I think we will probably do so formally in a peace plan. I suspect it will suggest something saying that we're okay with a lot of settlements, and that will become the new baseline U.S. position. On refugees, this administration is already moving towards taking refugees off the table by challenging the very status of refugees and UNRWA. Because when you challenge UNRWA, you're basically challenging the legitimacy of Palestinian refugee claims. And security has really never been on the table. So at that point, I don't know what's left on the table. And then we move forward with a new U.S. Position. And again, I think some will say that this is a miracle. Some will see it as a catastrophe. I think some actually, including amongst the Palestinians, will say at least all the masks are off. Now we can have an honest discussion. Because you know what? The U.S. policy has been leaning in this direction for many years with, even with the best of intentions, but a lack of political will. So maybe this, for some people, will be, okay, now we can have a much more honest conversation, and Palestinian society can have a reboot on what we do and don't support, or they do and don't support, and we move forward from there. Whatever it is, we're moving to a new era.
Here's the happy ending. The happy ending is that this administration hasn't evidenced any ability whatsoever to actually manage a process. No matter what it is, the plan, if there ever is a plan, they wouldn't know how to operationalize it. They wouldn't know how to organize the parties in support of it. So my view is whatever's in this plan, if it indeed is a plan, if indeed they're even capable of assembling what would charitably be called a plan, there's no evidence to date that they would be able to manage a consensual diplomatic effort to get to yes. That's the happy ending.
And after all this rather pessimistic note, do you think, is there still hope for a two-state solution in this issue or
You got
not?
the fun question.
Yeah, I'm supposed to now lift the mood. Okay, I'll try to. Look, ultimately, I really don't see any option but a two-state solution. And this is a very, we can go into depth into this, but simply when you have two national movements seeking self-determination, it's very hard to see how they can find a solution without separation. Now, the fact there's no solution doesn't mean that the problem is not going to go, no other solution, doesn't mean the problem is not going to go on for a while. Certainly, a two-state solution is not an available option in the short to medium term. I still think it's the only strategic option, but in the short to medium term, it is not really an option. And here, there are many factors, Palestinian politics, Israeli politics, but to the topic of this conversation, I think the Jerusalem announcement, the move of the embassy, has made it very, very difficult to see how one can move that way. Among the Palestinians, before this, there was actually a debate. Do you engage the U.S. administration? Do you not engage the U.S. administration? And both sides of the debate had valid points. After this, it became very clear. This Palestinian leadership and any Palestinian leadership cannot engage this administration as long as the Jerusalem issue is still hanging out there, and I don't see how it's going to be reversed. So this is kind of one component. The Palestinians simply cannot now, and Abbas had said it, a priori, I will say no to any American proposal until they move back on Jerusalem, and of course they want. Zoom out a little bit to the point that Lara mentioned. If the idea was to build an Arab coalition that will pressure, support, etc., the Palestinians, well, this made it very difficult. This made it very difficult on two levels. On the one level that Lara alluded to, no matter what Arab leaders think about the Palestinians, the reality is when it comes to like Jerusalem, it forced them to take very hardline positions in rejecting this.
Hardline?
As hardline as they can get, basically full rejection. There was no nuance there.
But again, if I could interrupt here, President Sisi, for example, a few days ago, held some sort of meeting about Gaza. And he was asked, what about Palestine? What about Jerusalem? And he said, look, we can only do what we can do, which isn't much. And it was essentially saying,
it is okay.
No, but if I may,
we'll swallow it.
If you look at, no matter what they think behind closed doors, what this showed that when Jerusalem is the issue, the official positions that they take, their ability to diplomatically move, to diplomatically maneuver, has been extremely limited. I personally believe that what we have seen from the Arab countries is the most that you can expect from the Arab countries. Right. I don't know what more we're going to ask for them. Sever relations with the United States, it's not going to happen. But within the space of their diplomatic ability to move, they have all taken a very clear position. And one would assume with this, they'll be very hard-pressed, even if some of them wanted to engage with an American peace proposal, they'll be very hard-pressed to do that. And one of the reasons as well is that the Jerusalem move, counterintuitively maybe, has empowered Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority. Those who will try to now pressure the Palestinian Authority will find themselves open to accusations that you sold out in Jerusalem, etc., etc. So in that sense, it created, if the idea is to do this outside in, well, it's very hard to do it, both for internal reasons as well as diplomatic. Thirdly, it actually, in a way, has sharpened and revived some of the axes and the tensions that we have seen in the region that have been dormant or behind the scenes for a while. We saw this competition of summits. We saw the Arab summit where the Saudis were taking the lead and trying to show that they are the ones who are the champions of this issue. We saw the Turkish, the Islamic State summit. So we're seeing, again, this becoming a political football in what was already a divided region. And this has played to the detriment of some of the traditional allies of the United States in the region who could have been positive actors, in particular Jordan, which in my view is going to be indispensable in anything to move forward, certainly on Jerusalem, finds itself stuck between having to take a position on Jerusalem and at the same time having to play with all of the axes in a way that does not necessarily please some of its Arab supporters, and on the other hand, creates tensions in its relation with the United States. So all in all, if you look at it from a diplomatic management perspective, put aside the substance for a minute, it's hard for me to see how anything positive came out of this if you think in terms of building, stabilizing regional diplomatic relations or regional politics, or if you think of it in terms of building or setting up the pieces in order to create a momentum behind an American peace push.
I could just add to that.
Sure.
The other piece of it that is, I think, I agree with everything they said, but I would add to it, even if there was the idea that over time the Arab world, Arab countries would just sort of wear down and accept this and move forward with it, it's not as if there's a political stable status quo in Jerusalem that they can be comfortable with. We are seeing the move by the Trump administration not only matches the increasing emboldenment of the religious right in Israel, but is actually emboldening it further. So we saw around the embassy opening this huge influx of political, of religious and extremist Jews who go up to the Temple Mount to pray, which has always been, a controversial thing. That's happening in larger and larger numbers. The pressure to change the prayer arrangements on the Temple Mount to allow Jewish prayer, which is not incorrectly seen by Muslims as a change to the status quo that is directly threatening to Muslim equities. We saw this in Hebron. Anyone who believes that the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron is a model of religious tolerance and coexistence really needs to revisit that. So to the extent that there's maybe a belief that eventually they'll just get used to it and live with it, and right now it's just political cover, it is almost guaranteed that people on the ground who want to fundamentally change the status quo are going to make that impossible.
One question, leaving aside the diplomatic reactions, what would be the, do you think the public opinion in the Middle East will be a factor in this issue or not?
Certainly. And while it is true that we have seen no great outpouring of demonstrations, and while it is questionable whether a new generation today among Arabs actually cares about the Palestinian issue like the old generation, the politically operative reality is the following. No Arab leader that I'm familiar with is willing to test this hypothesis. I hear a lot of people saying that Arabs don't care right now. Well, if you're the leader of an Arab country where things are already fragile and messy and you're coming out of an Arab Spring, you are not going to try to test this hypothesis. And this is exactly what we saw in the Arab League summit, where countries where you can see anecdotal indications that the public doesn't care anymore or even angry at the Palestinians in some ways, their leaders still stuck to traditional positions that they took because they feel that this is an issue that might be dormant today, but they're afraid that it continues to be alive deep inside, and no one wants to poke this monster and see if this monster is going to remain dormant or will take to the streets.
But they are poking the monster every day.
Not on this issue.
Well, again,
on this issue, again, I mean, I'm not talking about their behavior in general. I'm talking about this issue. As of yet, we are to see an Arab government that takes a position, an official position, a formal position, that actually moves below the traditional standards put through the lowest common denominator of Arab diplomacy.
Well, you're raising the bar in order so that no one can jump over it.
What do you mean poking every day?
Because there are no material decisions that have been taken which give a picture of effective or an attempted material opposition to decisions that the United States has made. And it's not Israel in this case that is at fault. This was an American decision.
The last time that there was an Arab reaction was 1973. So again, let's put it in perspective.
No, I'm not saying that that anything has changed, but I'm just stressing the point that for those who have been charged with making the calculations here in Washington and perhaps elsewhere, the decision was everything we've heard or been told about the consequences of our action is not enough to force us to reconsider what we might do and now what we've done.
Kadir wants to jump in.
Well, one of my points was going to be about the regional sort of realignment recently. I think this has a lot to do with it. you might be right that formally Arab countries could express sympathy and could care about the Palestinian issue, but they care about something else more, right? That's Iran. And the recently sort of unspoken formed alliance and against Iran, you know, the Saudis, UAE, Egypt, Israel, with the Trump administration now, they're having their best days these days, right? Iran nuclear deal is down the drain, and now the Jerusalem decision. I think this sort of unspoken alliance, let's say, is a counter-revolutionary force, and that's been going on for several years with the sort of Arab Spring running into civil wars in Syria and Libya. Many of these regimes have weakened. So even if they were to state the sort of made the strongest statements about Palestine, it's gonna be hollow more or less. But I think their coalescing around the Iran threat as they perceive it is much stronger. And you all three know the Palestinian history much better than I do, but you know, often the regional dynamics and global dynamics, Palestinians are sacrificed along the way, and I think we are witnessing a similar dynamic right now. In the name of confronting Iran and getting U.S. on board in a big, bold way, these regional countries you're mentioning, they're content with those formal statements that don't mean much, I would say. But at the same time, with those countries like Turkey, who's outside of this, OIC statement was mostly a statement, but you saw the embrace of BDS there. And I don't know if that's that novel, and I don't know if it's going to be implemented by the Muslim countries in a big way, but I thought that was significant. And Turkey also took measures, recalled its ambassador. The secular opposition in Turkey called for permanent, actually, recalling of the ambassador. So for Turkey, Palestinian issue...
From Israel.
From Israel.
Not from Washington.
No, not from Washington. The ambassador from Washington was brought back to Ankara for consultations only. So the countries outside this mini alliance, anti-Iran alliance, I think are trying to find a way to obviously address the Palestinian aspirations or support them in a serious way, but at the same time, it's not going to be that easy. This regional dynamic, I think, is very strong, and Trump administration came down really hard on the side of the Saudis and others who are ready to confront Iran in a serious way in the region.
Do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, just 2 points here. First of all, I think if anyone was expecting that the Arab countries will react in a way that goes beyond diplomacy, sorry, this was off the table since the 1970s. It has been clear in terms of the way this issue is managed is through the diplomatic means. So I think raising expectations in that sense is totally unrealistic. It's not like before the alliance.
Do you think are they going to be committed to the diplomatic process without Jerusalem now?
They cannot. I mean, what this showed, and this is actually goes to the second point that you raised, that this shows that while the anti-Iran coalition is real, and frankly, it's a real reaction to what they perceive legitimately as a threat to their interests. So the reaction is there. But I think what the Jerusalem thing has shown is that there are limits to this coalition. No matter what privately some might want. At the end of the day, the diplomatic reality in the region is such that even though in this alliance, they cannot, and they felt at least, they feel that they cannot cross certain lines when it comes to Jerusalem, when it comes to certain Palestinian issues. So in that sense, to be honest, I don't see anything new. The region has always been subject to alliances. The Palestinian issue, like many other issues, has been one of the factors within it. And we're seeing the same here. And like always, the Palestinian issue is never the priority, yet it's not one that you can completely ignore. So what I see is, in that sense, nothing new. Yes, the Trump administration has fallen on the side of the anti-Iran coalition in the same way that the Obama administration was seen as on the other side. These dynamics...
But Saudi, Egypt leadership on this particular
Saudi and Egypt
issue,
have been particularly clear.
Very...
Both have been particularly clear in every statement that has made by any official, whether it's in the Arab League summit, whether in the foreign ministers meeting, whether in their unilateral statements. This has been clearly a red line. And I am beyond that. I'm not sure what should be expected from them.
Lara?
No, what I would just add is, and it's sort of what I alluded to a second ago, I think we're in a weird moment when people are talking about this again as if this is static. We've seen what the reaction is to the move of the embassy. Okay, we're there, we've seen it, and it's very much what both of you describe. I would agree with Ghaith, it's not unexpected. I would not have expected the entire Arab world to jump up and do anything. I think it went as far as it could. I think when you look at not just the Iran coalition, we look at things like the aid relationships. There's no possible way that Jordan can basically put its entire relationship with the U.S. in jeopardy over this. That's where we are right this moment. I think it's really important to actually pay attention to Jerusalem. As my colleague Denny Seidemann always says, what really destabilizes Jerusalem is not political moves, it's not diplomatic moves, it is threats real and perceived to sacred space. For anyone to assume that based on where we are today, there is not going to be a real or perceived threat to sacred space in Jerusalem in the coming period, when you have the forces of the Israeli religious and nationalist right more emboldened than at any time in history, in some sense led by a U.S. ambassador who has devoted his life to the cause of greater Israel. If you believe we're not going to see a provocation that does make people feel like sacred spaces being threatened, I would urge you to reconsider. At that moment, it is a real question what happens, both in Jerusalem, which as people who are defending the embassy move have been very quick to say, look, Jerusalem's stable, nobody cared. All you people who said there were violence, there'd be violence, you'll be wrong. I would remind people that a lot of us who work on Jerusalem did not say there would be violence. We said it's possible, but we did not forecast it based on this move because of the sacred space issue. I would suggest that is going to be coming. I suggest that this would be very destabilizing for Jerusalem, and the pieces are in place. It's just a question of when they move. And the Bibi government, the prime minister, is under enormous pressure to let far right-wing members of Knesset go up on the Temple Mount, to switch the arrangements, to allow prayer on the Temple Mount, all of that stuff. When Jerusalem really does become destabilized and it's based around sacred space again, I don't know how that resonates in the rest of the region. I know it is not a status quo issue then, certainly not for Jordan, whose peace treaty with Israel puts Jordan gives it responsibility for the sacred space in Jerusalem. I don't know how it resonates in Saudi Arabia as the keeper of the holy shrines. Jerusalem is the third holiest spot to Islam. That is not a small thing, and it resonates popularly. So I would urge people not to just look at where we are today and assume that there's anything stable about where that is going forward.
But again, it's important to recognize historically, in 1948, when the UN decisions, and 47, about the internationalization of the city, and then subsequently the decision of the international community not to recognize Israel's status as sovereign, even in the West, lest we forget. This was not because they were sensitive to Palestinian aspirations. This was because of a concern about the effective opposition mobilized in that era by the Arab world and the world of Islam as well. So today, to the extent that we try to frame this narrowly as a question of concern to Palestine, that's true. But that represents a transformation of the issue itself from the broader context in which it has been set very firmly since the late 1940s.
I'm very clearly, I'm going to be clear. I am not setting it as a Palestinian issue. I'm setting it as an Islam and Jerusalem issue. And that's why I think it has very distinct reverberations. There is the Palestine piece of it and how it reverberates for whether or not people can support a US-led peace, quote unquote, peace process that sacrifices Jerusalem. That's one thing. I think there's a separate issue when you actually see changes on the ground to what is seen as a threat to sacred space. I think that's substantively.
I know there's a heated debate. Let's get some questions from the audience and then we will continue. Let's start with you, sir. Can we have the mic over here?
Yeah, Dan Lehman, two quick questions. Israel gained an awful lot. You would think they would have to pay heavily. Do you know what the great negotiator got for the United States out of the recognition of Israel? And the second question is, has this isolated the U.S. more and made it not greater, but lesser?
As far as we know, there was no quid pro quo. As far as we know. And that's not inconsistent with past practice. The Trump administration is not the first, certainly, to make these kinds of substantive changes to its policy without reciprocating action. If there is one, I'm not aware of it.
Look, as far as the more isolated, I would look more broadly. This administration appears driven by an idea of what it wants to do and doesn't have a lot of interest. There's sort of a, we will do it and you will come along with us, either because you'll see we're right or by force you'll see your interests, or we'll punish you and you'll do it. Between this move, the Jerusalem move, which led to a UN General Assembly vote where we actually threatened implicitly that we would cut aid to people if they didn't vote with us, and they still overwhelmingly did not vote with us. I mean, I wrote a piece analyzing the vote. It was very strongly isolating of the U.S. and Israel. If you look at what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal, the way that we pulled out of the deal, the fact that we pulled out and the way that we pulled out has now isolated us and put enormous pressure on the transatlantic alliance. That doesn't seem to bother this administration at all. The idea is we will push on through and we are right and we will succeed and everyone will see, and like we'll make a lot of money and we'll get rich and that'll prove we were right. Remains to be seen. It is certainly for those of us who believe that alliances and international law has a purpose and serves the interests of the American people in the world, it's alarming, for sure.
I mean, the administration would tell you, and they've been saying this now, the president himself had said it publicly, that Israel will have to pay a price for this. The price is deferred to the future, though. None of us have seen the peace plan or whatever it is that they might come up with, so I will not prejudge what's going to be there. But what I would say is a repeat of what I said earlier, that this is almost now an academic moot point. Because, the moment to pressure Israel for some concessions was the moment you made that announcement. Now, when the Palestinians are saying, we will say no to any proposal unless the U.S. reverses its position, this all becomes, in many ways, moot. But it's still worth saying that, at least in their public statements, the president is saying that there will be a price to pay.
Bearing in mind, I have to say that a concession as defined by the U.S., say a concession like Israel will have to give up Abu Dis and let the Palestinians have a capital there, is not seen as a concession by the Palestinians. It's seen as an abrogation of the U.S. role and a betrayal of the entire idea behind Oslo and the sacrifice made by the Palestinians coming into Oslo. So one man's concession is another man's imposed consequence.
Kadir?
Well, so far we've seen the Trump administration's policies in the region as taking these unilateral actions, and without, you guys alluded to that, without providing a comprehensive sort of plan. And I think similar thing is going to happen when they announce the ultimate deal. It's going to be a heavily sort of pro-Israel plan that won't satisfy any of the parties, maybe except the Netanyahu government. And I think that role of the U.S. has been, the statistic has been that, look, we have a plan, we just can't get the parties to agree to it. Now, the U.S. has abandoned that position, and I think that's going to have implications for whatever happens going forward. The U.S. has literally rewarded Israel for the occupation, continuation of this occupation. So I don't think next time around it will be able to claim the status of a broker or honest deal maker, whatever. So in any kind of future negotiations, U.S. and Israel will be seen as sharing the same position. But at the same time, since Trump administration is not in the habit of providing comprehensive answers to all these questions, the next deal they announce will be probably a narrow one. It won't satisfy the Palestinian side at all, and then there is the danger of further, obviously, destabilization and violence in the region. I think the Jerusalem decision, like Jeff was saying, has this historic sort of weight behind it in this sense. U.S. is no longer there to make sure that there is peace, even if we pretended that it was going to happen for a couple of decades.
Let's get another question from the gentleman. Yeah, please identify yourself.
Hi there, Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post. Thank you all for this very interesting panel. If I can ask two very quick questions. First off, given the rightward lurch of the Israeli government and this administration's willingness to march in step with the Likudnik or broader right-wing Israeli agenda, do we also see the possibility of more people thinking seriously about other versions, other solutions for the Israeli-Palestinian problem? I'm specifically thinking, say, something like the Naftali Bennett vision of things, which for so long we've assumed is a completely fringe, hard right position. Could we see in Washington more advocates for that kind of solution coming to the fore or entering the mainstream? And then secondly, just to ask a bit more about the gap between the Arab street, quote unquote, whether it exists or not, and senior Arab leadership. We know quite clearly, and I can say from my conversations with Saudi officials in particular, that there is not much interest at all in, or really emotive interest or political interest in the Palestinian solution or in finding them. We know the Saudi Crown Prince is much more interested in Israel's high-tech sector than he is in some kind of political liberation of the West Bank. Is there a cost that they are going to be facing themselves politically at home? I don't really see why they should be that worried.
Who wants to start?
Good point. Yeah, let's take the last point.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they've made that same bet, right? That the costs of not obstructing in any material fashion a decision by the United States are certainly acceptable, and the benefits that they anticipate as a consequence or have already gained outweigh whatever risks they feel that they may be running. This is a transformation from the past, and in part it's based on the concern about Iran, but also in larger part, I think it's a function of the historical reality that these countries have never been weaker than they are today in their entire modern history. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, U.S. forces have occupied how many Arab capitals? They've also been assaulted by their own people. And we know that from all these international surveys, the Arab state system has fallen behind, has not produced. Not only that, in U.S. eyes, historically, in the last 15 or 20 years, the conclusion was reached that these regimes had failed in efforts to protect the U.S., 9/11 being the most important indicator in their own view. So they're not coming to the table with a lot of assets here. And it could simply be that the other parties to the conflict have taken the measure of these nations and found them wanting, or found the opportunity to make these kinds of what I think historically will be seen as dramatic changes in the diplomatic landscape in the first instance, but also, as Lara suggested, in the physical landscape of the city itself, which, being here in Washington, we oftentimes tend to see the city as a museum, but it's not a museum. It's a dynamic place where people live, go to school, work, and so forth. And the extent to which the Arab part of the city, to the extent that there is today even a cohesive Arab part of the city, can grow and prosper and be seen as a place where you can raise a family, get a job, and so forth. That part of the city's fabric is also something that is under threat, as anyone who has walked the streets of the city can attest. I think I first went to Jerusalem in 1973, all right? And if I walked down Salah ad-Din Street then, and I went back there tomorrow and walked down Salah ad-Din Street, which is the main commercial street on the eastern side of the city, it's almost the same. It's almost the same. It hasn't moved by and large. And you can't maintain that kind of stasis in the physical infrastructure of the city and expect to promote and establish a beacon for Palestinian sovereignty and economic independence.
Lara?
So I very much take your point, and I mean, I've traveled quite a bit in the region. There are moments when you feel there's some grassroots concern for the Palestinians. It tends to follow other political trends. I think people are very much engaged in their own business right now. I think that changes if and when the action shifts to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. I think that's much harder to maintain, not merely as a political talking point, but in terms of grassroots feeling. You know, for me, as someone who wants to see a stable Jerusalem, I'm happy that this year's March of Flags was not as provocative as in previous years. The police kept it down a little bit. Given how emboldened the hardliners are right now in Israel, I think you're going to be seeing optics that look a lot like the March of Flags. This is the annual Jerusalem Day festival when far right-wing youth parade through the Arab parts of the city, the Palestinian parts of the city, with racist slogans and flags and singing about Muhammad. I think you're going to see stuff like that on Temple Mount. And I think when you do that, that really does shift the ability of anyone to of people to stay silent or maintain calm. On your first question, the idea of other plans, and that's a perennial. I mean, I've been working with the Hill for years. The Naftali Bennett types have been up on the Hill for years talking about their own ideas of one state, or one state plus something less than a state or whatever. I mean, we are at that moment where you sort of see the anti-two-staters on both sides, come together. We hosted something at my organization last week about the Nakba, where you had Palestinian voices who say 2 states have failed. There's many one-staters there. They have their mirror image on the Israeli side. It's always been there, which says we can do something other than 2 states. I agree with Ghaith, and I'm not someone who is emotionally invested in it has to be 2 states. It's the best thing. It's right. It's perfect and just and moral. No, 2 states is the least bad option that could guarantee some sort of stable future for both peoples. I think we get back there no matter what sidetrack we get taken on, and I suspect there'll be a lot of snake oil salespeople on both sides selling really, really compelling visions, sort of a Sim City vision of what the future is if only the other side will just stop being the other side. I don't think that's a solution. So we'll no doubt we'll have people selling that here.
You want that, especially for the second part of the question, is you mentioned this multiple times that the Arab leaders did their best. Is it did they do their best, or aren't they? Maybe they are not just interested in doing anything.
No, but just a quick point on the first one. The one idea that's making a resurgence is the idea of the Jordanian option, which had been, we all thought was dead and buried. Now it's coming up again. And I can tell you the Jordanians are very worried for good reason. And that could be really destabilizing if we lose that particular corner of stability in the region. On that one, look, first of all, if you talk about the Arabs, you know, it's not a monolith, all right? It differs depending on the country. You look at countries which are directly engaged traditionally, Jordan, Egypt, you do see actually a lot of commitment. It is almost inculcated in their official narrative that this is a national security issue that they do care about, I think, in a deep way. And I think it's unfair to characterize these states any differently. You look at the Gulf, look, surprise, maybe I'll surprise you here. They never really cared. I've been doing this for many years. I've dealt with many. It's not like they have a sense of the emotional investment that you have in some of the others. They have their political calculations, and their political calculations are twofold. Some are domestic, relates how their street will react. Some are diplomatic, relates how do you play the diplomatic game and how is diplomatic axes managed and formed in that region. And as of yet, I will repeat what I said before. I have seen nothing to indicate that in terms of formal positions, the Arab leaders, much as they would tell you differently in private, pardon me, are willing as of yet to do anything official, public, that will deviate from their previous positions. Now, could they theoretically do something different? Maybe. Again, they tried it in the 70s. Ever since, they have made a calculation that their engagement will remain in the diplomatic front, and they will be doing now exactly what they would have done in the 90s and 80s. The Kuwaitis in the Security Council have tabled a proposal, etc. So I don't see, any discontinuity from what we see the Arabs doing now from what they were doing in the 90s and in the 80s. You might argue that's not enough. That's a different argument. But as of yet, I just don't see any fundamental shift in that in their calculations.
Kadir?
Well, I can piggyback on a conversation I had just the other day with a Palestinian friend, and he was making a distinction between countries with electoral process and then those who don't. And in the ones that have electoral process in one way or another, including Turkey, it matters. Both politically it matters, and emotionally and for cultural reasons as well. And I think Lara's emphasis on that is correct. It really goes beyond a certain political sort of segment of the society. In Turkey, the first reaction about Turkey was, oh, it's Erdogan's reaction. But very first day, the opposition party's leader called for really serious measures, including canceling the Mavi Marmara agreement between Turkey and... So I think it's not just a matter of foreign policy issue or a national security issue for a good majority of Muslims. So, but that can reflect itself as a real debate in the political space and where it's possible. But in other countries, when that doesn't exist, I think it just keeps eating away their legitimacy underneath. Eventually, can that result in something? We don't know. But Arab Spring said, showed us never say never. We don't know, like, people don't have to, rush to the streets in millions or hundreds of thousands to support Palestine. But I think these regimes, when they go along with these measures, and when it becomes so central, like Masjid al-Aqsa, Jerusalem, it's a different ball game. And I don't think you can easily predict how that's going to manifest, that reaction and lack of legitimacy, even with, especially we consider these governments are very weak. I mean, Egypt and Saudi Arabia had to be part of the solution on this, right? Now we are seeing them, despite their diplomatic statements, one way or another going along with this. So I don't think it's easy to argue that that does nothing to their legitimacy as a regime at home, even if there's no electoral politics, even if we don't see huge demonstrations.
Lara?
Just to add, I mean, I don't know, for folks who look at Twitter or read the Hebrew press, for instance, today, there is a picture on Twitter, it's reported in the Israeli press. It's a picture of the US ambassador standing next to a picture of the Temple Mount with the temple rebuilt in the place of the Muslim holy buildings. I mean, that's the sort of image you would have expected to see from people who are seeking to have this become an explosive issue in the region. If you're trying to create images that feed the worst fears of people in the region, even if they don't give a crap about the Palestinians or Palestinian national aspirations, stuff like that does it. And we're going to have a steady diet of that going forward because that's the course we've been set on.
So, based on the situation that you set out and that what we've been speaking about generally here, it seems that the main challenge of the Israeli administration today is not to take too big a bite in the future, not to be drunk with expectations that the door is finally open to the end of days here and to dramatic changes on the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, dramatic changes on the ground in the city, and so forth. And I think in some respects, as ironic as it is that we have to depend on Bibi Netanyahu not to awake the sleeping giant here and to be modest in his expectations about what Israel can and cannot do, notwithstanding the dramatic receptiveness of the overall political environment, not only in Washington, but certainly elsewhere in the Arab world. And certainly, as Lara suggests, he is subject to tremendous pressures from his right wing, who themselves may see this as the beginning of the end of days. And probably Vice President Pence would second that based on his speech in the Knesset. But I think that the responsibility, and if we have to depend on anyone here, unfortunately, it's on Netanyahu to see soberly the opportunities and also the risks. Unfortunately, he's not the best poster boy for making those assessments correctly, as we've seen even in 1996, for example, around the Wailing Wall and so forth.
But Jeff, you're answering a question that this administration isn't asking. It's sort of like when people say, well, what can the Trump administration do to lessen the crisis around the JCPOA, around pulling out of the Iran deal? Well, they're not asking that question. You can offer them advice. They're not looking for it.
No, this
administration isn't looking to help this, as far as I can see, to help the Israelis manage this. I would expect, here, let me lay out a guess, not a prediction, but a guess. I would guess we're going to see the U.S. ambassador go up on the Temple Mount soon. I'm just going to put that out there. Wait for that optic. I think that is not a crazy prediction. This ambassador, within a few months of going to post, started going to West Bank settlements. Unprecedented. Nobody really cared. I reported it. Nobody cared. I would expect we are going to see these things happen. They are not looking to roll this back. So giving them advice on how to roll it back, how to keep from this becoming a crisis, I don't see them asking for that advice or taking it.
I'm not giving advice. I'm making an observation about the responsible party here, ironically, is the Prime Minister of Israel.
Let's get another question. Bassam, can we have the mic over here?
Thank you. Bassam from People Demand Change. Laura, the question is for you. It's very clear that the Muslim community, OIC, and the Arab League, they failed big time. It's clear that the Muslim community or the OIC and the Arab Leagues as a leadership, they failed big time to address Jerusalem issue or to comfort the administration. And it's not new. It has been for years and years. My question is a little bit different about the Jewish, American Jewish, or the Jewish leftist, J Street, like your organization, the Jewish organization in Israel who used to support the peace talks or two-state solution. Where are they? Are they weakened again, or they cannot fight back? I don't know. Thank you.
So I should be clear. I worked for Peace Now for a long time. I don't anymore. I work for the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which is not a Jewish organization. So I don't speak for a Jewish organization. I can say as an observation, we are certainly, the left in Israel is very, very depleted right now. I don't right now see signs of resurgence. We're always hoping for it. There's a new leader of Meretz. The Arab parties are more engaged than ever. They're also under greater pressure than ever. It's possible that out of this pressure we'll see a resurgent effort and political organization. I don't know. I hope so. Here in the States, I mean, look, this is the Jewish community. The Jewish community is in some ways very divided on the Jerusalem question. Even folks on the left who are very supportive of peace have been very troubled by the lack of recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I'm, all of us who feel in our hearts, well, of course Jerusalem is Israel's capital. The problem is how you technically recognize it and when you move the embassy and stuff. It's a difficult question for people who, like myself, who grew up every year. Next year in Jerusalem it's important. Jerusalem is a piece of the core beliefs. I do think, though, that this Trump administration has so energized parts of the Jewish community. The majority of the Jewish community is very progressive, is, I think, very troubled by the whole range of positions that this administration is taking, not just on Israel-Palestine. I think in some ways it's easier to get people to see the problems with their Israel-Palestine policy in the context of an administration that is so problematic across the board. On top of that, you're seeing, I think, more evidence of this generational resurgence or the surging generational divide, or not divide, I don't want to say it that way, but we see a younger generation that's much more courageous and edgy in their protests. I don't know if the numbers are there yet, but it's very exciting, starting with, the J Street Youth and the If Not Now, which is, even more courageous. Peace Now still has a very strong youth following. JVP is stronger than ever. I do think that, in some ways the choices are clearer now than they've ever been before for the Jewish community. If the choice is black and white, either you are all in with an illiberal vision of Israel's future, or you stand up for the principles that you believe in, whether or not you're a two-stater or a one-stater or whatever, but you have the principles that underlie all your beliefs. And if you're in that second category, you stand up and have to oppose this and say, not in my name. And I think you are seeing more of that. The response to the Gaza violence has been, or the shooting into Gaza has been extraordinary.
Let's get this question and then.
Hi, Vince Lofaso. I actually wanted to follow up on this two-state solution question. I mean, we've been hearing this for like decades now, and one state, two state. There's a blockade in Gaza. There's an occupation in the West Bank. I'm wondering if, given that the one state, two state, does that, instead of focusing on the occupation, does that give Israel an advantage to furthering the occupation in the occupied territories? And I think from Ghaith, maybe I want to ask you specifically, what about the internal dynamics within the occupied territories? With Fatah, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, we have an aging Palestinian president, Abbas, and it's pretty hard to see where the unification is within the Palestinian community. Palestinians like to see themselves as a nation, but right now, given these political divisions, it's really hard to see where it's coming from. Maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very simple question. Look, you have a situation where, on the one hand, the national identity is still very strong. I mean, if you ask Palestinians, whether West Bank, Gaza, diaspora, the sense of Palestinianness, the sense of nationhood is still extremely strong. On the other hand, the political structures that carry this national identity, I would argue, have not been weaker since maybe the 1930s. A combination of the division between West Bank and Gaza, Hamas and Fatah. Add to that the eroding legitimacy of both movements. Both are seen as corrupt, ineffectual, and more importantly, the vision presented by both towards self-determination has been delegitimized. Diplomacy, which I still think personally is the way to go forward, yet 25 years of failure have left their mark, and you have a generation just simply doesn't see it. On the other hand, the quote-unquote resistance, violence, etc., has also failed. Hamas has been ruling Gaza now for 10 years, 11 years, 3 wars, no results. The resistors are not allowing others to resist. So in that sense, you have this, and you have a generation that's growing up that feels strongly Palestinian. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons I don't think one state is possible, because these people feel a sense of identity, yet at the same time do not feel that their political energy can be challenged through any legitimate structures. What do you end up with? You end up with a degree of frustration, a degree of people are checked out until they're not checked out. Almost every major eruption in the Palestinian scene has been preceded by by a period of this kind of ennui that we have been seeing right now. So I'm actually quite worried about Palestinians rising up against everyone and everything.
Anyone who wants to add something? If not, I have a question about the other international actors and what can their role be in this process, like European Union. Maybe what can European Union play? Can it play any role at all in this process, or finding an alternative solution for the problem?
Well, we are at a crossroads here, right? For the first time in a generation at least, the new American administration, Trump, inherited a diplomatic landscape that was barren. Right? There was no system that everyone agreed to. There were no ongoing negotiations. There was no plan over which the parties were debating. So he had the field open to him to draw his own picture about what the future framework would be based upon. And this decision is one of the important indicators, just as Balfour was, in creating a new diplomatic landscape that the parties would have to accommodate. Having said that, there are other voices out there. There is an international consensus based on the maintenance of the principles of the last many decades, from 1948 through Oslo, that enjoy the support, at least rhetorically, of the EU, Russia, China, many in the OIC and elsewhere. Now, the question is, and President Putin, for example, has offered to host new talks. I don't know if anybody's responded, but again, the offer is there. And again, what that suggests is that there is an opportunity. The question that we can address at some point is it an opportunity that actually has legs, that one can actually project to make the transformation from an idea to a plan and a system of engagement. That test hasn't been met yet, so it's unclear. The opportunity is there, but again, the opportunity is in some respects there across the board with this administration, as Lara has suggested, has undermined rules of the game everywhere. So for those people who want to either reassert the old rules of the game or to create a new game, the opportunity is there. Whether people will take that opportunity up is yet to be seen.
All right.
So I'm going to differ a little bit on the question of the rules of the game. I think it's clearest if someone else wants to come in and try to figure out a peace process. The stakes in some ways are higher. With the JCPOA, U.S. pulling out of JCPOA, we're seeing Europe have to struggle with whether or not it actually has any economic sovereignty, right? We have an effort here by the U.S. to use sanctions, the banking system, effectively to say you will become tools of our foreign policy or you will suffer absolutely debilitating consequences. And Europe is having to try to figure out how it says we are actually sovereign and we will not allow extraterritorial sanctions to decide our country's policies. On Israel-Palestine, for years I've gone to Brussels and had conversations with people. We talk about settlement policy, and I've always tried to get Europeans to frame this differently because I do a better job framing their policy than they do. Europe doesn't have a settlements policy. Europe has an international law policy, right? Settlements, how Europe deals with settlements is a direct reflection of its adherence to international law and its belief that international law actually has force and must be upheld. It does not have a violence in Gaza in policy. It has an IHL policy, international humanitarian law. This is fundamental to the state system after World War II, is the state system within which we operate. The question here for Europe when it looks at how the Trump administration is dealing with Israel-Palestine is it going to continue to defend and uphold what it has so far seen as its interests? Is this system of international law, of international organizations, of international norms? If it doesn't, that is a choice that has ramifications that go far beyond Israel-Palestine. And it's going to be challenged on this every single day going forward. I would raise one more thing, which I've been tweeting about today. The Palestinians, based on this Jerusalem decision as of last week, so now between the Jerusalem decision and the Gaza violence, I don't call it violence because it's more than that, the Gaza situation, they have now formally gone to the ICC, right? That right away triggers US repercussions. They're probably not significant repercussions because technically they've already been triggered, but they're there. Technically, our law says you will face repercussions. The only other option the Palestinians have left of their nuclear options is joining UN agencies, which under US law means the US has to drop out and defund every UN agency the Palestinians join, which is effectively the beginning of the end of the international UN system. When we defund the IAEA cannot exist. These are the challenges that are attached to this. Do other countries defend the international order? I don't know, but the Israel-Palestine question, really, the ramifications of it go far beyond, does someone else jump in and come up with their own peace plan? What is at stake here is, does the international community still support international law, international order, international organizations? And it remains to be seen.
First of all, it is very clear, if there is going to be a real meaningful peace process, it will have to be US-led. And this is what Abbas heard when he went after December 6th, after the announcement. He went to, I believe, London, Paris, and later on Moscow. And they all said to him, we sympathize with you, we disagree with the Jerusalem decision, yet the process will have to be led from Washington. In reality, what this means is we're going to have a period where there's going to be no process. Since from the Palestinians' point of view, they cannot deal with this. So what can the rest of the world do? It certainly cannot supplant the US, but it can do a number of things. First of all, just what Lara said, hold the fort. Hold the fort when it comes to international law. Hold the fort when it comes to positions vis-a-vis settlements, etc. Hold the fort when it comes to the actual issue of embassies in Jerusalem. The worst thing, so far we've had 2 other countries moved their embassies to Jerusalem. If this becomes a trickle and then a trickle becomes a flood, then we're in a bad place. So this is where I think Europe can play an important role, as well as, frankly, with the way they would engage with US in Jerusalem itself. Will the European ambassadors attend events and functions at the embassy in Jerusalem? These are, again, maybe diplomatic things, but all signifying that Europe holds the fort. That's one. 2, I would say, where the US creates a vacuum that risks an immediate response, the international community can actually come in and fill that vacuum. What I have in mind in particular is something like UNRWA. The US is not going to fund UNRWA right now. I think the world is an opportunity to show how much they're willing to support such a stabilizing institution. So this is what I would think, particularly here I'm thinking Europe. From the Arab countries, I would expect, in addition to, of course, giving the diplomatic support to the Palestinians, I also would like to see some, how shall I say it, frank conversations with the Palestinian leaderships, not in public, etc., but dealing with some of the internal dysfunction that the gentleman asked about here in terms of Palestinian politics. I think it is not only unconscionable and bad for the Palestinians, but bad for the region, what is happening in the Palestinian Authority, the closing of the political space, the crackdown that we see on anyone who is political, things of this sort. So I think right now we have to accept that there will be no conflict resolution. So in this period, A, you make sure that things don't get worse to the extent that you can. B, you find areas where you can still have an impact to make an impact on. And let's see if we can ride the next 3 to 7 years.
Thank you. Kadir, and if you can also add Turkey's viewpoint on that. Turkey has been the harshest critic of this decision, convened 2 OICs and co-sponsored the UN General Assembly decision about Jerusalem. So if you can elaborate on that as well.
Well, I mean, Palestinian issue has always been very important for Turkey. This goes back decades, not just the AK party governments, but you know, in the mid-2000s, Turkey tried to broker a deal with Syria and Israel that fell through. Later on, with the Mavi Marmara incident, relations really broke down. That was again about Gaza blockade, and now with Jerusalem, they withdrew the. So our analysis that we wrote during the time of Mavi Marmara was saying that as long as this Palestinian issue worsens, when you look at Turkey-Israeli ties, they become worse during the times that Palestinians are in conflict with Israel. So I think that dynamic will stay there, if not get stronger, because this goes beyond foreign policy. It's not about just Gaza's isolation in this case. It's about a sacred place. We just talked about it quite a bit. I think that's going to be very central and important for Turkey. Elections are coming up. You're probably going to hear even more about this coming out of Turkey, but post-election too. I heard President talk about boycotting Israel. So that brings me back to Europe discussion. I think boycott measures will be critical if they go really far and wide, if they take on a course of their own. I'm thinking of pressures that could be created on Israel. The biggest power that can create that kind of pressure is the U.S., and U.S. just gave a freebie, with the Jerusalem decision. It wasn't willing to ask for something concrete in return, and going forward, it probably won't do that. So now, Europeans, if they decide to, because I think with the Iran nuclear decision, the lack of U.S. coming, abandoning that deal, and then earlier on, U.S. showing no serious leadership in Syria. Both cases, you see regional powers trying to readjust to this reality. So going forward, we're going to have the same dynamic. Some will go to Russia, as Jeff was saying, see what they can do. Some will go to Europe. And if, Merkel was saying that the U.S. is no longer reliable, if that becomes a serious sort of source of policy for Europe, they may start thinking about how to pressure Israel. Will that be enough? Can that override the heavy sort of weight of the U.S. policy, U.S. strength, or U.S. influence over Israel? But at least it can maybe change certain bounds. But I don't expect an immediate sort of, and I certainly, I agree with you. They're not going to come up with a comprehensive peace plan anytime soon. But they can perhaps try to make it more costly for Israel to go further than this, like Jeff was saying. Netanyahu figuring that this is the time with Trump administration, let me just go as far as I can, and that will certainly create a worse situation in the region.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. I will get that before we wrapped up. Ragip.
Ragip Soylu, Daily Sabah. I was looking at Special Envoy Greenblatt, Steve Drakan, yesterday, and he was saying that he was going to visit Qatar to basically collect or campaign for some aid to Gaza. But in terms of the U.S. reaction to Turkey's actions, I see that U.S. is ignoring Turkey's actions, and Greenblatt is not visiting Turkey, is not engaging with Turkey in terms of the Middle East peace plan. So how would you interpret this inaction or basically being silent on Turkish actions, not just like Turkey's recent actions with the Islamic Summit, but the UN General Assembly?
It precedes all of that. When the Americans held a session on aid to Gaza a couple of months ago, I think it was, the Turks weren't invited. Even then, this is before all of these other issues broke. The international organizations weren't invited. Who else? The Palestinians didn't come, weren't invited. I don't think
they were invited.
They were invited, didn't come. The Israelis were not invited. I don't know. So the exclusion, if you will, of Turkey is not necessarily a consequence of unhappiness with recent decisions that you mentioned.
And just one thing. I mean, also Turkey's role in Gaza had really lessened in recent years. While it continues to have good relations with Hamas and continues to provide some aid, really it's been Qatar that has been doing most of the humanitarian aid, reconstruction, etc., that we have seen, especially since 2014. I think that's one of the reasons. And look, even Qatar itself, it's very problematic. The kind of, on the one hand, clearly is providing aid, and that's also why also the Israelis are working with it. On the other hand, it goes beyond simply giving aid and their support for Hamas. So it's a complicated political situation. Yet, I think we're in a place right now where anyone who is willing to provide aid to Gaza, there is willingness to put aside some of the other disagreements and engage these actors to come and provide aid. I think this is one of the issues that I think there is now. We have consensus emerging that giving aid to Gaza, assistance, at least dealing with the basic humanitarian crisis that we see, is a priority. And one point here that even if the Palestinian, so far the Palestinian Authority has been one of the reasons why aid is not going to Gaza, because they're refusing to be the conduit. I feel a growing international sense to even bypass the PA and go and give aid straight to Gaza. So right now, I think it's a season where anyone who is serious about giving aid to Gaza will have a seat on the table.
Lara, I would just add, this administration is very transactional in its relations. To the extent that right now Turkey is cut out of this, my own guess would be that's because Israel doesn't want Turkey dealt into it. If there is an improvement in relations between Turkey and Israel, and that is, again, transactional in nature, I suspect things would warm up between this administration and Turkey, or where Turkey works with this administration on something else. I mean, we are seeing there are no deep alliances with this administration, except maybe with Israel. There are short-term objectives and the alliances of convenience in the service of short-term objectives. Turkey right now is on one side, very much by choice of that equation, and could probably move, but that's where it is now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. Please join me to thank the panel.
Thanks. Thank you.